I know some folks are still filtering in, but we've got a packed agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And please just feel free to fill in all the seats so we can make sure everyone can get into the room. Well, hello and welcome today. Welcome to the Wilson Center, and thank you for coming for a special event marking the conclusion of USAID's Measuring Impact project. Thank you to those of you who were here earlier for the deep dive on conservation enterprises, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us now watching the live webcast online. I'm Megan Parker. I'm the Senior Writer Editor and Partnerships Director for the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. So just a few quick words about where you're sitting. The Wilson Center is the living formal memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. And this year, the center is celebrating our 50th anniversary of bridging the gap between scholarship and policy in the world of international affairs. And for half of that time, for 25 years, my program, the Environmental Change and Security Program, has championed an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how environmental issues like biodiversity are connected to economic development, global health, and national security. And we've been rated by the Global Think Tank Index as one of the top 5 think tanks in the world on both international development and on transdisciplinary research. So given that we have so many great speakers today, I want to turn it over now to Colin Holmes, who will introduce the rest of the speakers. You have complete bios in the program, which I think everybody got. But briefly, Colin is the contracting officer's representative for measuring impact in USAID's Office of Forestry and Biodiversity. Previously, he served as a Foreign Service officer in both Nepal and Bangladesh, and prior to joining USAID, he worked in environmental compliance for the International Finance Corporation and spent several years in India studying public health as a Rotary ambassadorial scholar. After Colin and the other speakers give their presentations, we'll have a very productive Q&A session. Start thinking now about your questions and make sure they're questions, not speeches. It's very important. There will be a reception afterwards, so you'll have plenty of time to make speeches there. And if you're watching online, you can tweet your question to @NewSecurityBeat using the hashtag #MeasuringImpact. So Colin?
All right, do the usual thing here. Let me get this up. If I can get it to stick. Stay. All right, this is wonderful to see such a packed house. Thanks a lot, Megan, for the nice introduction. As Megan said, my name is Colin Holmes. I am a Foreign Service Officer based in Forestry and Biodiversity Office here at USAID. And for the past about 2 years, I've been the contracting officer's representative for Measuring Impact. It's been an incredible experience, and I'm really happy to be here today with you all to take a look back at the last 6 years or so of this global program and reflect on some of the lessons that we've learned. A couple quick housekeeping things. Megan mentioned this, but so this is, it doesn't say agenda, but this is your program and includes inside. In addition to the bios of the speakers at the end, you'll find a list of tools and resources that we've developed under this project. So this is a helpful one to hang on to. And then the trifold, which you may have picked up as well, looks like this. And the trifold, both Cynthia and I will be referencing this, kind of describes what measuring impact is, what we accomplished in summary. So with that said, I want to point out one more thing. We refer to this as the Washington, D.C. Closeout event because we've held 3 other events in the field. We did this because we didn't want to have a single event where we had to fly in lots of people from other countries, high carbon footprint, for all our climate change friends out there. We are environmentalists after all. We did it because we could engage more people this way. And it seemed appropriate to recognize folks in the field who really are the ones who made this whole thing happen. We supported them. We drew upon their experience to develop tools, resources, et cetera, and we wanted to recognize them and where they are. So we did an event in the Philippines, in South Africa, and with Peru as well. Those were regional. 2 of them were regional webinars. One was an actually in-person event that we just piggybacked onto, but they went really well. We tried our best to engage the folks in the field, implementing partners, and especially USAID staff, because this is a real internally focused activity, that were engaged in the process and recognize them there. So this is our DC-based event. To kick things off, I'm going to introduce two people, and then I'll sit down. To kick things off, we're going to hear first from Carrie Thompson, our Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. Thanks very much for being with us today, Carrie. Carrie came to her position following her service as the Deputy Mission Director at USAID's Regional Development Mission for Asia in Bangkok, Thailand, where she provided oversight on regional programs that address transboundary challenges, including human and wildlife trafficking, economic integration, and shared use of natural resources, and on bilateral programs in China, Thailand, and Laos. She is a career member of the U.S. Senior Foreign Service and has held various assignments in USAID offices and missions. She's a great champion of both conservation and of adaptive management to support more effective development programs. Following Carrie's remarks, we will hear from Cynthia Gill, who some of you heard from if you came to our noon program. Cynthia is the director of the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity here at USAID headquarters. Cynthia has in-country experience with biodiversity, wildlife, and forestry issues in more than 20 developing countries. Since joining USAID in 1993, she has led the design, implementation, and procurement of a wide range of multi-million-dollar conservation programs and has helped design many USAID programs and many USAID missions, including efforts to combat poaching and wildlife trafficking. So these are our next two exciting speakers. It's time to get started, so please let's give a warm welcome to Carrie Thompson.
Thanks so much, Colin. It's terrific to be in a room just packed with people who I know are passionate about biodiversity conservation. It's really a great event for me to come to. So good afternoon, everybody. It is my true pleasure to be here this afternoon to celebrate the accomplishments of this outstanding program, which has really upped the game for biodiversity conservation at USAID and set the stage for a new generation of biodiversity programming. USAID Administrator Mark Green has emphasized the importance of working closely with our partners, measuring both their progress and the effectiveness of our investments, as we continue to support greater self-reliance of countries around the world. Over the past 6 years, USAID's Office of Forestry and Biodiversity, or FAB, the FAB office we like to refer to it as, has focused on exactly this, the effectiveness of our investments. The office has worked with the Measuring Impact program to build the capacity of staff around the agency to design and learn from biodiversity programs, as well as to build and apply the evidence base that informs programming decisions. To guide our work, we outlined a set of expectations for best practices in biodiversity programming in the agency's biodiversity policy, which, as many of you probably know, was issued in 2014. Through the Measuring Impact, or MI contract, FAB has been directly addressing the administrator's priorities to deliver improved development outcomes in biodiversity programs based on evidence and learning. We are committed to this approach because we know that conservation of biodiversity is fundamental to human well-being and thus to sustainable development. Functioning natural systems, in fact, are critical to human survival itself. USAID invests resources each year to implement forestry and biodiversity programs that address the threats and drivers of biodiversity loss while contributing to human well-being in areas of public health, food security, and democracy and governance. With the MI activity, USAID has made significant progress in operationalizing agency policy and developing tools, guidance, and capacity that strengthen our ability to design, implement, monitor and evaluate, and adaptively manage this portfolio. I understand from all my colleagues that these approaches have been adopted widely, and there's an increasing demand for these services, reflecting a real thirst that I know is out there for robust and strategic programming tools. To continue to achieve development results, this is what we have to do for our biodiversity programs and ultimately for all of our other programs. Let me just pause for a moment and say that I know how important and urgent this work is. While serving as the Deputy Mission Director at the Regional Development Mission for Asia in Bangkok, I see one of my colleagues there, Dan. I really came to appreciate just how serious the threats of habitat and species loss are to our development mission. I saw the wildlife trafficking and illegal fishing crises emerge in Southeast Asia, and just how quickly decades of conservation progress could evaporate, leading devastation and instability in its wake. Biodiversity conservation is complex. The tools, evidence, and guidance developed by the field, for the field by FAB and our partners within and outside the agency have increased the impact of a significant portion of USAID's biodiversity and integrated programming. One of the great accomplishments of MI is that it has set expectations and provided resources and support to help USAID staff and implementing partners enhance program design practices and apply evidence and learning to improve our work at each stage of the program cycle. We are trying to remove barriers to working effectively because being more effective will help us help countries as they progress on their journey to self-reliance. As an agency, USAID is focused on strengthening our core capabilities, empowering people to lead, and respecting taxpayer investments, among several other things. FAB's work on MI has helped us use resources more efficiently and support improved work in the field. So FAB and MI have been real pioneers in this effort over the last 6 years, leading the way in providing critical technical assistance to field missions, a path that other offices can follow as USAID's transformation process continues. I'm impressed every day by the skill, professionalism, and above all, the dedication of our team of implementing partners around the world in delivering quality biodiversity programming. I'd like to offer my congratulations to the staff of Measuring Impact, looking at several of you there, and the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity. I look forward to seeing the fruits of this work and the next generation of programs. The challenges just continue to grow. To meet them, we need to revolutionize our work through the dedication and visionary thinking of partnerships just like Measuring Impact. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for your excellent remarks, Carrie. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming. This is quite a view from here, a packed room, which I'm really thrilled to see. So welcome again to the Washington, D.C. closeout for Measuring Impact. I'm Cynthia Gill, as you heard, and I just could not be more delighted to be here right now and to share and reminisce with those who've been on the journey and to share this with those of you who are new to what we're doing here. So as you all may know, I hope, USAID launched a biodiversity policy back in 2014, actually July, exactly 4 years ago. And that policy is grounded in a recognition that human well-being and progress are dependent on the health of biodiversity systems, and durable development gains are not possible unless these systems are valued and safeguarded. And the first goal of that policy is to conserve biodiversity in priority places. So as we ended a previous round of programming, which was really built on on-the-ground programming and getting lessons from that, in my office, we thought, well, what should we do to help achieve conservation throughout the agency and to implement the biodiversity policy? So what we did not do is say, you should do protected areas and conservation enterprise and this, which is, I think, a little bit of what was expected. Instead, we said, we want agency programs to set clear conservation targets, apply solid analysis and evidence, and to implement a program that adapts to an ever-changing reality to get conservation impact. And by the way, mostly that's through drawing boxes and arrows and having long conversations. Think of that as we see we're all here to celebrate what you can do with boxes and arrows, really. So to help us do that, we designed MI to help in implementing best practices in adaptive management, including program design and learning practices that would help us achieve better outcomes throughout the portfolio. So one key reason for this success is that these practices align with USAID's policy priorities for programming and for collaborating, learning, and adapting, or CLA, as we call it at AID. So we really worked hand in hand with the agency's policy gurus, which seemed like a reach, I think, when we first started that. It seemed maybe like a long shot, I think I would say, but it completely worked. And what it means is we were developing a system that implemented the agency's agendas and processes and helped the field meet agency guidance and not just create another system. And it's a constant challenge to make sure that that's what happens. At the same time, the approach that we developed through MI is not just aligned and supported with USAID policy, but it draws from the open standards for the practice of conservation, so which many of you are quite familiar with, which I think hopefully brings the two systems into a happy symbiosis. So, USAID is a development agency, of course, not a conservation organization per se, but our work is firmly grounded in the reality that conservation is development and that functioning natural systems are critical to human survival and to a country's own journey to self-reliance. Some of you may know that I've been with AID for 25 years, and I can't say that during each of those years I felt the agency really understood and internalized those concepts, but increasingly I do. And I think we're seeing that in many ways. And I think that this work that we're doing also helps people to see that, to apply it, and to realize it and make it true, right? Because the concepts need to be applied properly to play out. FAB and MI's shared goal was to significantly up the agency's game in conservation programming. So FAB's work, and not FAB, it's the AID conservation community, helped us to support missions and build capacity across the agency to more effectively design, monitor, and evaluate effective programs, and then build the evidence base to inform programming decisions. So I have to say I am incredibly proud of our accomplishments over the nearly 6 years in terms of what we've achieved. And in fact, and I shared with Rebecca and some others from back then, like it was not clear how far we would get in this. And I think we felt like we were maybe overreaching, and this was all, we'll see where we can get, we'll see what the appetite for it was. So to see where we've gotten, and you see all of those products out there, we've really come a long way. We have a full suite of tools, like tools that you can use to apply this if you talk to no one here in this room ever. We have an army, however, if you want to talk to them, we have an army of enthusiastic adaptive management advocates throughout the agency, and as a result, a more robust, agile, and targeted suite of programs. So before I highlight some of our achievements under MI, let me express my deep admiration and gratitude for the committed group of conservationists, other development professionals, program officers, policy gurus, and more that joined us in forming and implementing this vision. So I had like 2 minutes of thank you in this, and I cut it because Colin also had that. But let me tell you that gratitude is really deeply felt and appreciated. And it just feels great to be part of a movement, really a movement to do this throughout the agency. And then, you know, the rubber really hits the road, of course, with our field mission and partner staff and stakeholders as well. Okay, so now for the numbers part. So hopefully you all picked this up. And if you didn't, get it on the way out, because this has all the key highlights of what we've done. And of course, this is about documenting what you do. So, you know, we did. It's here. But I'm going to highlight just a few of those details. So these are just some of the big ones. Okay, so in the beginning of MI, we focused on just 5 missions to work with. And it was kind of some work to get 5 missions that were aligned with some of our goals. That, you know, was a process. But then over the last 6 years, MI has supported us in 20 missions around the world that program biodiversity funds. And then FAB, the regional bureaus, and MI face constant demand for additional services. This work, and I think this is amazing, has directly influenced, meaning we've worked directly with programming for more than half of the agency's biodiversity funding and more than 3/4 of the biodiversity funding in our Tier 1, our top top countries that are targeted as part of our policy. We provided jointly, all of us have been talking about, more than 5,000 person days of technical assistance to agency and mission programs for over 24 activity designs, 37 activity startup workshops, which I'm not even sure we thought were a thing when we started, 35 theory of change-based monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans, and 15 assessments and evaluations. And there's also now something called pause and reflect, which isn't mentioned here, which we definitely did not think was a thing when we started. FAB has also captured important knowledge in the form of tools and guidance with the help of MI, since we can't actually support every mission, every mission's request for technical assistance. So this knowledge and related skills are now actually taught through FAB's entire training curriculum. So that's part of the standard training now that the agency does. It teaches you how to do this. You can also find it all on the Conservation Gateway, which should be linked on every document that we have. This could keep you busy if you're looking for summer reading the rest of the summer. So one of those, we developed 3 biodiversity how-to guides. Those alone could probably keep you busy for the rest of the summer in close collaboration with USAID's Policy Bureau. So these guides help missions and partners comply with the agency's policy on program design by walking them through step by step how to actually use these tools in the USAID programming context. So it translates, along with a related suite of products and tools to deliver content to meet varied adult learning needs and styles. So that includes short video, testimonials, interactive online resources, briefs, case studies, and evidence syntheses. One of the most used tools that was produced in the program was to help us improve the effectiveness of our efforts to combat wildlife crime. So it's the Combating Wildlife Crime Toolkit, which is also out there. So that was actually cited by the Government Accountability Office, better known as GAO, as a bright spot in the US government's work on combating wildlife crime. So we don't always only get told about our bright spots, so we were happy about that. And it's quite widely used by missions and implementing organizations in the design of their programs. With MI, FAB launched the Biodiversity Cross-Mission Learning Program, which is a systematic way for USAID staff around the world to learn from each other's experience based on theories of change and learning agendas. And one part of that, which you saw earlier today, and there's documents out there if you didn't, a suite of materials to share the findings of a 20-year retrospective evaluation of USAID conservation enterprise programs that was presented at noon today and highlighted what we learned in a fascinating and interesting way. And then we published an overall biodiversity and development research agenda and submitted a number of research products for publication. And then finally, something called Evidence and Action, which a legacy of particularly Diane's work and leadership throughout, that maybe we should be applying evidence in our program design and implementation. And this resource supports USAID staff in generating and applying evidence. And I will tell you, in reading it, like, mostly it makes you feel like, oh, okay, I did know part of this, and it just makes you check the box, because I think that's so intimidating. Like, oh, I can't do evidence-based programming. That's like way too hard. There's no evidence or whatever. This just walks you through it and helps you understand what you can and can't do. So maybe that would be more of the summer reading category, a little lighter. So these are just a few of the impressive accomplishments. So I'm just highlighting them here to demonstrate the leadership of our program in implementing of USAID and MI in implementing programs to improve biodiversity conservation and well-being in achieving our goals under the biodiversity policy. So I think all of us understand the time and dedication this change in organizational culture demands. And hopefully by the time we finish hearing from all the speakers today, we'll be able to think of at least one aha moment when we realized our investment in adaptive management is paying off. I am so delighted with our lineup of speakers today to celebrate the accomplishments we achieved with MI and to spread the word and share it. Okay, and next we have Melissa Patsalides, the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator of USAID's Policy Bureau, and previously the Director of the Office of Learning, Evaluation, and Research, followed by a panel of experts who will speak further to what we have learned. We'll have some time for discussion with the panelists, followed by a reception. So I'll hand it back to Colin. Thank you.
Again, thanks a lot, Cynthia. That was fantastic. You got the fun part, talking about all the great things that we accomplished. So as Cynthia mentioned, we have a good group of panelists following our keynote speaker, and they're going to bring in perspectives from USAID, from implementing partners, and also from those who worked on MI. Our panelists are going to provide their insight and their experiences engaging with missions and practitioners, discuss the practices, processes, and tools we've developed and promoted under MI, and explain how the evidence paradigm has shifted. That is a placeholder for an incredible talk by our amazing Dr. Diane Russell. Teaser. So wait for it. Okay. Collective Collectively, our panelists are going to tell a story of how they helped create an enabling environment for better biodiversity programming. With improved adaptive management, you're going to hear this over and over again, adaptive management, and enhanced collaborating, learning, and adapting, CLA. How many of you have heard of CLA prior to coming here today? Oh, you see, you're in the right place. Or the wrong place if you want to learn something new. But just kidding. So you, stay, please stay. So CLA is our, you know what CLA is, I won't go into that. And then our chief of party, Liz Locke, will be moderating the panel. So I just wanted, before introducing our keynote, I just want to mention really, really briefly, again, referring to the trifold that hopefully you by now have in front of you, what MI is, just to sum it up in a few, like 3 points. What does MI do? And if, keep referencing this so that people want to go back to it, you take a look at the bottom stretch, the bottom frame here, right there, you will see, and the first 3 points are basically covered under the enabling conditions strengthened. So MI focuses on building the human capacity, both within USAID and our practitioners who work with us, to implement better practices, to use better biodiversity practices. It also, that's the first point. The second, and you've heard this over and over again, MI has a strong focus on learning and evidence. So we've promoted, what Cynthia mentioned, this cross-mission learning platform. It's an online platform, but also very much an active, engaging process of missions sharing what they learn with other missions. And then there's been a number of evidence products and knowledge products associated with that work that has been shared across the community through that platform. And then the third piece is really focusing on the policy enabling environment. And Cynthia referenced our work with PPL on that front. And that's really important, particularly for the process of trying to take what's best practice in the conservation field, using the open standards for conservation, and bringing them into USAID, converting them into our language, and then developing tools and resources that help implement those best practices. That third stream of work is focused on that. So those are the 3 main things. And they're in your book. I should just point out that we've had, our focus has been at the mission level, the cross-mission, cross-sectoral, and the agency level. So that policy work was primarily at the agency level. With that said, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Melissa Patsalides. She's the acting deputy assistant administrator to PPL. Melissa is a seasoned international development professional with nearly 20 years of experience focused on program planning and effectiveness. Melissa previously directed USAID's Office of Learning, Evaluation and Research. I think actually Cynthia mentioned this. She oversaw the implementation of the policy related to evaluation, monitoring, and learning, and this applied to USAID programs worldwide focus. She has been with USAID for the past 15 years and is one of the agency's leading voices for the best practices that we have focused on in MI. So it's been really fortuitous that we have a program that actually is focused on implementing the kind of policies that Melissa and her team have been promoting. She's deeply committed to finding effective and efficient ways to support good development, and she and her staff have been tireless champions and partners of the FAB office in helping use these best practices. Melissa is a great advocate for using CLA, which you all know, as a way to operationalize adaptive management within USAID. So please give a warm welcome to Melissa Patsalides.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Colin, for that very warm welcome. As many of you know, PPL's Office of Learning, Evaluation, and Research helps USAID and its implementing partners use better practices for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and making sure that knowledge gained from those practices is used. We aim to help our staff and partners ensure their programming is based on evidence and to fill evidence gaps where needed through an array of approaches, including during implementation. And you may be surprised to hear me say that it's okay to have evidence gaps before implementation begins. But fortunately, I'm not the only one saying that. Many donors and development organizations have recognized the importance of continual learning and adaptation to make their programs successful. We don't always have all the answers, in all of the sectors and all the places we work before we begin implementing, which is okay as long as we put in place ways to fill in those knowledge gaps or to collaborate with others to do that. So, as you have heard, we've been a strong partner with the Forestry and Biodiversity Office and have very much enjoyed learning from the rich experience that this team has had. And that, along with knowledge gained from elsewhere in the agency, informed some policy tweaks that we made in recent years. And we're very pleased to be able to reflect with you all now on the great work that MI and E3 Fab have done that have really contributed to broader agency-level policy change. One particular example of that policy change, we established collaborating learning and adapting, CLA, as a way to operationalize organizational learning and adaptive management at USAID. CLA can help us in designing development solutions that are appropriate to the local context, responsive to local priorities, and adaptive to changing circumstances of the places where we work. For all of these reasons, we see a CLA approach as a critical element of supporting the journey to self-reliance in partner countries. Another one of the policy tweaks that we made was to underline that a broad spectrum of evidence is acceptable to inform program design and implementation. In addition to evaluation, we highlighted the importance of monitoring data during implementation, research, other analytical work, and knowledge that comes from the experience of staff and partners themselves to round out our evidence base. And we emphasize that we can and should take advantage of evidence produced by others and not to reinvent the wheel. We hope this will help our staff and partners allocate their resources for evidence gathering as efficiently as possible. And my staff hear me say this all the time, and sometimes missions are surprised when they hear us say it, but I will say it until the day I die. We don't hold up any particular method or approach as the silver bullet or the gold standard for answering all questions. We need a wide array of approaches to answer the kinds of questions that we have. One of the most exciting things about my work, and something I've always liked about the work of the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity and the MI contract, is their commitment to learning about what is working in our development programs, what isn't, and why. I can't think of another office and contract that embody the ethos of our program cycle more than these folks do, and it really warms my heart. Being transparent about our findings and translating learning into action gives us the power to correct course and ultimately increase the effectiveness of our investments. The CLA framework and practices are reinforced by the biodiversity policy and other agency strategies, tools, and guidance. And you have heard there are a lot of great pieces that have been developed. Thankfully now there's a large opus to help our staff and partners in this work. The conceptual overlap has been the foundation of a really fruitful partnership between PPL and FAB, as Colin mentioned. FAB and MI have excelled in helping to advance learning and adaptive management across biodiversity and integrated programs. I'm excited to be here today to highlight several major accomplishments of this partnership. Please pardon me if I repeat some of the examples, but they bear repeating. The CLA work coming out of the E3 Fab office and missions implementing biodiversity programs has been so valuable across the agency. It catalyzes locally owned and directed development for better outcomes, increases the effectiveness of USAID programming, and makes our investments go farther, whether in biodiversity, economic development, or in other integrated programs. There are so many firsts for CLA and missions over the past 6 years. In May of this year, as you heard earlier, FAB and MI held virtual closeout events to celebrate great progress that has been made. And a couple of those highlights that really stand out to me, based on where I sit, is the creativity in Asia, from pioneering the use of pause and reflect, it is a thing, in Nepal and the Philippines to inform monitoring, evaluation, and learning plans, refine their strategic approaches, and identify needed course correction. We also saw great work in Africa, where the Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment engaged partners and government to get a broad consensus for what this huge regional investment would achieve in an area larger than Belgium, to designing programs in Madagascar, Tanzania, and Senegal, and scaling up learning activities in Mozambique and Uganda. The Latin America and Caribbean region collaborated across the Amazon Regional Environment Program to create a theory of change for the Amazon vision that serves as a framework for learning across the region, while the missions in Guatemala, Peru, and Ecuador took innovative approaches to using evidence in activity design. MI and FAB synthesized learning derived from their work with 20 missions and helped to shape agency-wide guidance and tools. While there isn't enough time for me to list every contribution, it's worth noting that our program cycle and CLA toolkits now include the situation model and results chain, thank you boxes and arrows, tools as effective ways to promote and advance CLA practices and principles throughout USAID's program cycle. These tools are yielding dividends agency-wide and across all sectors. And these resources are now available for all USAID and implementing partner staff, and as I said, their utility extends beyond environment programming. The kind of cultural and institutional change that FAB and MI have sought and that we're working towards in PPL is hard. It is very hard. There are many barriers in the way, from people who aren't interested or don't have time to learn and adopt these new approaches, to real institutional constraints around procurement and human resource processes. We have to change rules, expectations, and even the culture of our institution to get the results that we're seeking. And this is a long-term effort. In the Office of Learning, Evaluation, and Research, where I have sat for the last 7 years until now, we have viewed FAB as a great partner in our efforts to inspire USAID staff to adopt a CLA approach. In fact, the MI team won the CLA Case Competition Video Prize in 2015 for the innovative approach to cross-mission learning, and this is a really, really cool example. The program recognizes the core challenge of our highly decentralized agency. It's difficult to apply lessons learned and insights gained in one country to the work of another. We know that mission staff are hungry for this type of cross-program learning, but we have few institutional processes that allow that to happen. FAB's Biodiversity Cross-Mission Learning Program, developed under MI, is one of the rare opportunities where a forum has been created, resources have been developed, and cross-mission learning has been encouraged in the service of better programming. As these examples show, some of the most promising practices for incorporating learning and adaptive management into our work come from the field. Certainly figuring out from my old perch in LER how to ensure evaluation findings contribute to action has been a challenge that PPL where we've gleaned a lot from the partner community. Some of what we learned has contributed to additional tweaks in policy. We brought planning for dissemination of results forward into the planning for the evaluation itself, so thinking about the ultimate intended use and users right up front. We've required USAID management action trackers to ensure that we're taking advantage of the information and doing something with that within our organization. We broaden the possible evaluation deliverables to focus on what is useful for stakeholders. It may be that a video, a podcast, an event would be much more useful than a lengthy report. No offense to lengthy reports, they're great too, but we also need to think more broadly about how to engage a broader range of people in evaluation findings. And finally, we remove the requirement for every evaluation to include recommendations, as in you should do this because of these findings. Recognizing that many times USAID staff and stakeholders needed to process the evaluation findings and data in order to determine the most actionable recommendations. I'm very inspired by a particular example of this from Jordan, in which the mission wanted to address a consistent problem it recognized they had, which was poor uptake of evaluation recommendations. So they scrapped their traditional process and developed a process to convene USAID staff, external evaluators, and relevant stakeholders to make sense of the evaluation findings and co-create the recommendations. This process has the benefit of preserving the integrity and the independence of the evaluation findings while also involving the key stakeholders who are the people most likely to need to take action as a result of the evaluation. Who knows? We may see this process become more the norm, which would contribute to much greater ownership of evaluation findings by local stakeholders. So watch this space. In 2 years, maybe that becomes our standard process. An additional priority as we develop the practices and tools to increase the effectiveness of USAID's programs is to consider dual needs around learning and accountability. For people in the monitoring and evaluation space, they're probably familiar with this age-old debate about learning versus accountability. Too often in the past, accountability was the overwhelming focus of monitoring and evaluation efforts. This squeezed out the space for learning and left implementing partners and USAID staff averse to taking risks, which in turn deprived host countries of some of the amazing innovations that our investment can produce. So while the debate about accountability versus learning may rage on among evaluators, US government agencies, and development donors, I'm certain that more and more organizations recognize the importance of both to their work. Learning and adapting as we go is critical to making our work more effective and to updating theories of change and building a stronger body of evidence. And because we're stewards of other people's money, we'll always need to be accountable for not only the funds we invest, but the results that we expect to see. But I hope that one day we'll be able to say we're accountable not only for funds and results, but also for learning and adapting, because I think that makes us a much more effective organization. We'll certainly need a focus on both to support aid effectiveness and the journey to self-reliance. Looking ahead, USAID is prepared to implement the new direction set forth by Administrator Green, which is focusing our assistance on contributing to self-reliance. USAID's focus on implementing through collaborative partnerships, organizational learning, and adaptive management has helped us improve how we coordinate our efforts, use evidence to inform our programs, and shift course when we find out what works and what doesn't. These approaches are also central to how we support countries to plan, fund, and implement their own solutions to their development problems. There have been so many wonderful accomplishments related to advancing learning and adaptive management at the agency through the work of FAB and MI. You have very much to celebrate, and we're grateful for the learning opportunities that your achievements have created broadly within the agency, and I can't thank you enough for the fabulous partnership. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for those inspiring and thought-provoking remarks. It's so valuable to hear your perspective, your experience, and to have your partnership. And we, our whole community here and listening on the web, appreciate your leadership in showing us the path to USAID becoming a learning organization, trying new processes. So thank you. My name is Liz Locke. I'm the Chief of Party of Measuring Impact, and I'm a partner with Environmental Incentives. It has been such a privilege over the last 5 years to lead the implementing team for MI. Our implementing team is made up of my organization, Environmental Incentives, and 2 incredibly talented and committed partner organizations, Foundations of Success and ICF. And we have so enjoyed the opportunity to implement this project. None of it could have been possible without the terrific partnership with the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity and the E3 Bureau and PPL. You guys have heard from Carrie, from Cynthia, from Colin, and Melissa. It's easy to implement a creative project and in a context like this when you are given the kind of vision that we got so clearly from the FAB office right from the start, the kind of willingness to embrace creativity and innovation. We had a stumble or two, and we learned from those and kept going. And to collaborate all along the way with our partners in the FAB office, to keep in mind the end users in the missions and in the implementing partner community. So we're very grateful for this opportunity, and it's been a lot of fun. We are now going to turn to the second half of the program. It's called MI in Action. So far we've kind of set the context for you, and helped you see where our work and our thinking fits into the larger agency context. In the next little while, we're going to talk to folks who have implemented the project from the perspective of USAID, from our own team. But before we do that, we could maybe use a little stretch, a little intermission in place. We're not going to take a break out of the room. But for the next 2 minutes or so, I will invite you to stay at your chairs, but stand up if you wish. Stretch if you wish. Introduce yourself to someone sitting near you, someone who you don't know that well, maybe behind you or in front of you. State your name, your organization, and maybe just share with each other what brought you here today, your understanding of CLA and your interest in the program. So take 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll go on to the panel. I hope you all met someone you don't know already. And at the conclusion of the program, we have a reception across the hall. So any conversations you started and I just interrupted, you can pick back up in an hour or so. So the next portion of the program is called MI in Action. We have three components. And then at the end of the third component, I'm going to take questions from the audience. So please do jot down questions as you have them, because we're going to go through quite a bit of material before we move to the Q&A. Now I'm going to move to my chair here. So on this portion of the program, we're going to be talking to 3 panelists. I'll conduct an interview, and we'll learn about our work supporting the 20 missions that we've worked with through MI. Immediately to my left is Rebecca Butterfield, who is the director of the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Unit with Tetra Tech ARD. Prior to joining Tetra Tech, Rebecca was the first contracting officer's representative for MI, so she brings to us both the implementing partner perspective and the USAID perspective and the MI perspective. To Rebecca's left is Olaf Zerbach. Olaf is a Biodiversity and Forestry advisor in the FAB office, and he manages the whole program of work for MI that provides the capacity development support and technical assistance support to missions. He has directly supported Madagascar, Nepal, and the South America region, but has also overseen the work that FAB does with all of the missions through MI. And to Olaf's left is Vinaya Swaminathan, who's a senior program officer with Foundations of Success, one of the key implementing partners on MI. Vinaya has led our technical support, particularly in Africa, and she's worked with missions in Asia as well, helping run workshops and develop capacity in USAID missions. Thank you all for joining us. Olaf, I'd love to start with you. At the beginning of MI, as Cynthia noted, our vision was to provide technical support to 3 to 5 missions. And over the last 5 years, that's grown to 20 missions. Can you tell us a little bit about how that expansion occurred?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think we were really pleasantly surprised by the response to MI. So, as we mentioned, the biodiversity policy came out, and MI was really designed to help support that implementation. And I think the policy's message of prioritizing conservation, making conservation priorities, looking at the threats and drivers in a really critical way, constructing theories of change, I think that message really resonated with our field staff. So we really had a great response to it. The approach of just learning by doing, building on success, and learning from failure, I think that really appealed intuitively to a lot of our colleagues in the field. So, as Cynthia noted, when we started with MI, we were really hoping to have, 3 or 4 or 5 missions join with us on this journey. And we ended up having a lot more interest in that over the years. We had 20 missions and 32 different implementing teams that we worked with, different activities in the field that we touched directly and indirectly. So it seemed like there was a pent-up demand for these types of tools and support for this kind of work. So we really tried to support as many missions as possible. So we met missions wherever they were in the program cycle, and we tried to figure out how best we could use these approaches to help improve their programming. The first mission that we worked with was actually the Nepal mission, and I think they ended up being the guinea pig for a lot of our efforts. So We went on quite a journey with them, but we first started working with them on designing a new freshwater conservation project. And it was an area that they hadn't really worked in before. There were a lot of unknowns in terms of what they should be focusing on. So we walked them through a process of identifying their conservation priorities, looking at their threats and drivers that they needed to address. And I think they really appreciated the sort of step-by-step process that we went through. And then they invited us back a couple of years later when they had a new mechanism in place and asked us to do a similar process with their new implementers. And they also really got a lot out of the process. And especially, I think, identifying the areas of uncertainty. So it was a new area. There was a lot of questions about what approaches were going to be effective. And so I think that really giving them the space to talk about it and say, hey, we don't know if this is going to be effective. We need to monitor this along the way. Let's create some learning questions around it. I think they really appreciated that and saw a lot of value out of that. And then we've been back a couple of years since to do pause and reflect workshops, which again we sort of invented as we went along with Nepal, and the mission staff and the implementing partners were really wonderful, and they worked with us. And each time we've learned something new in terms of their learnings, their lessons, how they can improve their programming. So I think as missions and implementing partners saw that value and sort of started talking to each other, especially on the USAID side, demand definitely increased. And all the work that we've heard from PPL in terms of the program cycle reforms and the CLA process, all of that was happening at the same time, so we weren't operating in a vacuum. So that also generated more demand. So in the end, I think we were really pleased with the number of people that we were able to reach.
Great. We, as you've mentioned, we were lucky to work with an incredible array of capable, forward-looking mission staff, both in environment programs and program offices. And we learned a lot of important lessons. I think it'd be great for us to share those. Vinaya, you were a lead trainer and facilitator right from the very first MI trip, I think. And it would be great to hear some of your takeaways from that experience.
Sure. Well, one takeaway, I'll kind of steal it from Olaf, because I think it's a really important one, is that mission staff and implementing partners really seem to appreciate having a concrete process and set of tools that they could use to do adaptive management. These champions are well aware of the value of CLA and understand its role in the work that they do. However, they seem to lack those stepwise processes and tools to help them operationalize that. So that was a clear need that we saw in missions, and it was something that we had a proposed set of tools to help meet. Maybe just building on that, when we took these tools to the missions, it was really helpful and really important to have those mission staff and those champions be involved with us to help shape and refine those tools that we developed, and also to make sure that they met their needs, the needs of their implementing partners, and were user-friendly. Olaf mentioned this already, but there was a lot of enthusiasm for learning and adapting, but these people in reality have very limited time. They're very busy people. So we also needed to have a set of tools that were, again, user-friendly and allowed them to do the learning and adapting that they needed to do without being completely overwhelmed by process. A recent example I can speak to comes from our work with the Mozambique mission. So in this mission, we worked with an environment team who wanted to learn about the effectiveness of the work they were doing to improve law enforcement to help prevent wildlife crime and to address poaching, a really serious threat that's happening and affecting wildlife in Southern Africa. And this was a really great opportunity for us to help them gauge how effective they and their partners were being at addressing this threat. So with that very clear objective in mind, we worked with the mission to tailor the tools and facilitate a learning workshop that brought together teams from both of those activities in the same room. We worked together to use their existing theories of change, harmonize them, and have those be the foundation for coming up with very, very clear, defined, focused learning questions that they could then use to harness and harvest lessons learned from each of those sites against that common learning question or goal. One fact that I can speak to that we received from our colleague in the mission, this person knew that CLA was important, but didn't necessarily know how to operationalize it until after we went through that workshop together. So again, another pretty clear example of having that stepwise approach and the concrete set of tools and process proved to be a challenge, and it was something that missions and partners grapple with and continue to grapple with, but it's something I think we've made a lot of progress on. Cynthia's point about the boxes and arrows, they've come in handy, basically.
Rebecca, is there a tip or a lesson that you think it's important to highlight for USAID implementing partners?
For Tetra Tech, we've been involved in quite a few of the MI programs that have projects around the world, and we really value the pause and reflect before an annual work planning. So really looking at what's working, what hasn't worked in the last year, how have our assumptions changed, how have risks changed. In the Lestari project in Indonesia, we did a midterm learning assessment, and we did that with someone from FAB, Diane, and the COR of the project, and it was really, really productive session to be honest and open about what's working, what's not working, where do we need more information, and this is, midterm in the project. And we realized that we were working off of a situation model or a problem analysis that had been done by AID probably 4 or 5 years earlier that was in the RFP, and we really needed to update that and have a situation model for each one of the 6 landscapes where Lestari worked. And also given the importance of the government counterparts that we were working with to help implement the program, we also needed a political economy analysis for each landscape. So that was work that was done over a 6-month period of time to reestablish those theories of change, a good situation model, look at the politics in each landscape, and then that became the basis for our work plan for the next year, which I think really helped to target activities. And it's really valuable in that process to have AID there in that conversation, because if you're going to start changing direction of your program or what you want to do, AID needs to know why and understand why you're changing paths or trying something different. And so having that collaborative approach is very important.
That's great, thank you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest in following up on that point. Olaf, you have a big picture view, having provided support to so many missions. What feedback did you get from the missions? As Colin mentioned, we did these virtual closeout events, and I hope there are some mission staff joining us today on the webcast, but we weren't able to have too many in the room here. So maybe you could help summarize for us some of the feedback that we got.
Sure, I'd love to. We got a lot of feedback along the way, I think, as Cynthia said. There were bumps along the way, and we definitely learned some lessons. But the regional closeout events, a couple things really stood out for me that the missions highlighted when they presented. The first was the need to really allow enough time to go through a careful and thoughtful process. This really came out of our work with the South America Regional Mission in Lima. They took on the challenge of designing a whole new conservation vision for the whole Amazon basin, and they were working with their technical counterparts in not only in the regional platform in Lima, but also in Brazil and Colombia and elsewhere, to make sure that they were kind of looking at all the drivers and all the threats across the entire region. And they really took a very strategic and slow and careful approach. They commissioned additional research and analyses to fill in some of those evidence gaps that we were talking about. And so I think in the end, it was a huge success in terms of designing a really robust and comprehensive program and a great vision for USAID in the region. But it did take time. I mean, I don't think they really anticipated the amount of time that it would take. It was definitely a lot longer than a typical design process. So they, that had some challenges along with it. Staff changed in the different offices in the mission, in the program office or the leadership or the procurement office. And each time they had to do a lot of work to bring folks along to make sure that they explained why they were taking this, really detailed approach. So they definitely, saw the value in it, but we learned some lessons there about how to anticipate the amount of time and effort it'll take. I think in Asia, the example that really stands out for me, and this was highlighted earlier, was the value of the Combating Wildlife Crime Toolkit. Wildlife crime, wildlife trafficking was an issue that really grew in importance in terms of USAID programming over the last few years. And so the toolkit was really instrumental, I think, in helping missions to kickstart a lot of their design processes, to look at what the common threats and drivers were, and really kind of move that along and help them learn from each other when they were implementing similar programs. And it also really helped us here in Washington because we were able to propose a set of metrics that missions could use to apply to their programming, and that really helped to, as was mentioned earlier, the bright spot of the GAO audit and the USAID metrics that came out of the wildlife trafficking work. A lot of that, was really helpful to us because of the toolkit was in place. So that helped us to have metrics we could roll up.
That's great. Thank you. There's much that remains to be done, of course. And Rebecca, I'd love to hear from you about challenges that you see that still remain for us as we try and operationalize the CLA approach through the community.
Well, I thought about 3 challenges. One is around the bidding process. So being on the other side and looking at RFPs, it's really great to see in RFPs the mention of CLA, also in RFPs dealing with biodiversity funding, the need for a theory of change. It's even more meaningful when there's evaluation points attached to those requests, and then people really pay attention. It is hard, though, I'll say, in working with teams to develop those proposals. You work on a theory of change, and then you should be writing to that theory of change. But the RFP is written with intermediate results, and it's written as a results framework. And so it's very difficult, if you have a theory of change, to then write to a results framework with the IRs and the tasks under that. And the writers will follow the RFP lead. And that leaves the theory of change in a M&E annex, which no one's really looking at. And it should be the central part of your proposal, but instead it's an annex to your proposal. So there's just a tension there between how the RFP is written and then what you really want to see. The second one is on performance-based contracts. So performance-based contracts is where your fee is tied to outcomes or outputs, often mostly outputs and then some outcomes. And that's just not very conducive to adaptive management. So for instance, if you have in your contract, you will train 10,000 people, and you learn after year 1 that training isn't the way to get to the end result you want, you still have to train 10,000 people. And that's just a bad use of resources. So how can those contracts, it's nice to have accountability and it's nice to have an incentive there, but how can those contracts truly help you do adaptive management? Because contract officers are very reluctant to change anything in the contract. They feel they're buying 10,000 people trained, and they don't want to change the terms of the contract midway through, but it really puts a damper on trying to do adaptive management. The third is really, how do we continue to do learning? How can we learn from each activity? And can the COR promote learning? Can they be flexible enough in adapting the contract and the direction that you're going? Our project staff have a lot of exposure now to the sort of CLA approach, to doing pause and reflect. And so we now write that into all our proposals, whether we're asked to or not, because it's really just a best practice. But I think we're all learning, how do we develop a learning culture within our organizations, and then how do we really use evidence and metrics for decision-making going forward? But I think it's a challenge we all have.
That's great. Thank you. Olaf, would you like to add to that? I think we're all in this room because we'd like to see these practices become a sort of new business as usual. And from the USAID perspective, where do we need to go? Well, from your perspective. Speaking for USAID.
Yeah. I think the points that Rebecca make, they resonate. I mean, at the end of the day, when time and resources are stretched, implementing partners, the CORs, they will go back to the contract or the agreement, and they will look at what's in there. And so if the adaptive management piece isn't in there, if there isn't a requirement to do learning, then that risks getting left by the wayside. So I think the more we can do to build those requirements into the language of the RFPs or the contracts or the agreements in the first place, I think will help us go, will go a long way towards making that more systematic. In general, I agree. I think we need to make our agreements more flexible and allow that space for reflection, maybe allowing more time at the startup period of a new project to be able to do additional assessments, refine some of those assumptions. Like we said, there's lag time between a time that a project is designed and it's implemented. Things change, new biodiversity threats come out and so forth. So allowing that time to adjust at the startup, I think, would go a long way as well to making our programs more effective and allowing for new information to shape our approaches and using evidence. And finally, I think, CORs in the field, a lot of times, they also have to work with their contracting officers, and so they may not always feel so comfortable, exploring opportunities for adaptive management with implementing partners. And I think, whatever we can do to empower our CORs in the field, to make that space, to have those conversations with their contracting officers, to allow for some of that adaptation over time, I think that would also go a long way.
Great, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you one last question, if that's okay. Vinaya, I'll start with you. A big part of the sustainability, or our hypothesis, is that the sustainability of the results in MI is to build capacity for USAID to keep doing this work after we're gone. Maybe you could, from your perspective as one of the people who was working hard to build that capacity, talk to us about whether you've seen a moving of the needle there.
Yeah, absolutely. The building capacity is obviously really critical to what we do in MI, and it's an indicator of the impact that we're having in missions. And I think we've definitely seen progress, and we've definitely moved the needle on that. One indicator of that we've looked for is whether or not, or the extent to which missions and partners are using these approaches and these tools without the support of MI. So maybe we get them started off using theories of change, but then they take it upon themselves to continue using that tool in their work. We've seen definitely several instances of this. One example comes from Uganda, where the environment team there, managing a biodiversity activity together with the implementing partner, had to redesign a really core component of their activity several years into implementation. And now this is a team we had worked with at the outset to help them develop their theories of change. But then when they were faced with that challenge of having to do the redesign, they took it upon themselves, they took the initiative to go back to their theories of change and use them in order to do that redesign. And that was without any additional support from MI. So a clear example of some built capacity there. Another indicator of progress is in missions like Nepal that Olaf mentioned, and some of the Tetra Tech projects that we've worked with, where we worked with them at the start of MI to help them get started with these approaches. And that being 6 years ago at this point, they've now come to the point where they're able to come full circle and really use those pause and reflect opportunities to look back on what they've accomplished, think about that in the context of where they're trying to go, and make the necessary course corrections as needed. They've enjoyed and appreciated and learned so much from those pause and reflect opportunities that those same projects and missions are now looking to repeat that process for their year 2 and year 3 pause and reflect opportunities or work planning opportunities. We've also seen a lot of champions in USAID. I think Colin mentioned the training program, the training curriculum. That's a real great opportunity to help build capacity, continue to build capacity within the agency. And I guess a subset of the cohort that have taken that or have gone through that curriculum includes a set of 16 biodiversity advisors. And these are advisors who are USAID staff who have received over a year of tailored coaching in how to facilitate the use of these processes. So they're going to continue to be valuable resources for USAID colleagues in Washington and in missions as well. Ultimately, all of this comes down to whether or not we're actually seeing examples in the field of conservationists being able to do their work better as a result of adaptive management approaches, the extent to which they're better able to achieve conservation outcomes. We're starting to see some of these examples trickle out, and those stories are really proving to be inspirational, very compelling for peers. But we need more. We need more of those examples, and that's going to be the key to sustainability, is having those examples in our back pockets.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, what do you see as some of the critical elements to sustaining some of the outcomes we've achieved in MI?
I think MI at the beginning was really focused on design work and working with the missions on the design of programs. And I think there needs to be more work, and maybe that would be in MI2. On the implementation side, so how do you follow through and continue to use those theories of change into implementation, which is taking it, so the COR is very bought into that your implementing partner is very involved in that, so that they're actually carrying it out on the field. And one of the areas that could be strengthened or reinforced, I would say, is the learning question. So once you develop a theory of change, it's fairly straightforward to go through and look at all those assumptions and think about what are the critical elements you need to answer, the questions you need to answer about, is this theory of change actually playing out the way you think it is? But we rarely see follow-through on the learning questions. It's really not built into work plans. It's not built into reporting requirements. And so it tends to fall by the wayside, like Olaf was saying. If it's not there in the plan, it sort of doesn't get done. And I think if it is built more into the work plans and reporting, then we can elevate the importance of learning and learning from that theory of change, and we can create a better culture of learning.
Great, thank you. Olaf, would you care to take the last minute to give us some final thoughts on how we can sustain these outcomes?
Sure. First off, I think we've made a lot of really great progress. I think we can be really proud of, the fact that we've worked with 20 different missions, these 30-something implementation teams directly and many more indirectly, I think speaks to the appeal of the approach. And I think a lot of that success, too, is, due to the alignment of the biodiversity policy with the ADS 201, the CLA process that's been rolled out that we've talked about. They're very mutually reinforcing, which is just really great. I mean, it gives us a great platform to do our work and to build on for the future. So I think we're in a really great place. Like I said, we still have work to do, and I think everybody would acknowledge that. Building these processes in so they become more systematic, I think, is definitely an ongoing challenge. But I think there's a lot of opportunities. We can build them into standard contract language. We can work with missions to build it into their own performance management metrics that they look at in terms of how they have incorporated some of these practices and these approaches. So, it was a lot of hard work to get to this point. I think the institutional thinking has shifted, though, in that direction for adaptive management. I think it's been a really great journey, and we owe all that success to our mission colleagues and the implementing partners that trusted us on the way. The support of PPL and folks here. It's been, there's a lot of hard work reflected here. So I think we're in a great position to keep it going.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you, panelists. Right now, we're going to shift to the next stage of our MI in Action, where we're going to look at our learning program. So I'll invite you guys to write down questions as you have them for the panel. Thank you very much. And I'll invite up the next group, please. All right, I'm very happy to welcome Shawn Peabody, who is a senior learning specialist with environmental incentives. And Shawn, along with Tess Present of EI and Megan Hill of USAID, has helped to design and implement our cross-mission learning program. And we're going to learn what we've learned about learning. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about learning. And the cross-mission learning program that was mentioned a couple times already on stage. First, a little context. So as we're starting out this program, sort of the situation you have is missions all over the world who are working on similar strategic approaches, maybe conservation enterprises, and there are different stages of the program cycle. So some might be starting out, just starting to fund work. Others might be ending. Others could be in the middle. And also different stages of success. Some may be having some great success and others looking for new approaches. And what we wanted to do is try and create a community where environment officers and other USAID staff are connected and they're able to talk to each other about these conservation enterprise approaches or whatever that similar approach is that they're working on. And the way we did this was by creating collaborative learning groups, which are communities of practice that tie those environment officers together around a theme that's built on theory of change. And so this program is run for three and a half years, and we had over 350 staff engaged, over more than 30 missions. We had 12 webinars, and we had over 200 resources on our online platform. So the next thing I thought I'd do is talk to you a little bit about the lessons we learned about learning that might be applicable to other efforts. So I'm going to go through these quickly. And first of all is to build on existing efforts. And it's so tempting when you're starting out to want to build your dream website or the very best thing, and sometimes it really feels like you need to start from scratch. But when you do that, you lose an opportunity to take advantage of people who already know each other, or websites that are, or other resources that are already there. And to really hit the ground running, you want to start with something that's already going. And so we did that with using the Forestry and Biodiversity Gateway, and that's where we hosted the learning group sites. We also did that with conferences and other events where USAID staff would already be together, and so we tried to capitalize on that to do side events or other activities in association with that. The next is motivation, which is... you guys heard that, right? I didn't imagine it? Okay, great. Motivation is really a critical resource. People are motivated, they want to learn, but learning is often not the number one thing on people's to-do list. When they get up and they go to work, it's not, I'm going to go learn something new. Although they may want to, it's hard to get to it. And so in order to really get people motivated, you have to build or provide information that's relevant to what they're trying to do. And you need to provide also trusted sources of information and opportunities also for interaction, because when things are just one way, then there's really there's a limitation to how much people can engage with it. So one example of how we did this was with webinars, where we bring in experts on specific topics that were of relevance to USAID staff, and they would present on a topic, and then there'd be an opportunity for two-way engagement between the experts and USAID staff. Next is to keep focus with a learning agenda. I think one of the biggest pitfalls you can have with the learning effort is that you get scope creep, where you start off and you want to learn, and then you just keep digging into additional and additional and additional topics because somebody is interested in everything related to that topic. But you can get blown off course and get to a point where things that you're learning about maybe aren't that relevant to the people that you originally were hoping to reach. And so to keep people focused, we use the theory of change. We're trying to learn about a specific strategic approach, and the core of that is the theory of change. And then we can use the theory of change as well as a framework to generate questions that are of relevance. Okay. Next is that you need a hub for learning. You need somebody who's able to make it their job, their opportunity to really push things forward. And so if you can think of these dots here as a social network and the lines, or people and the lines, the connections between them, learning needs someone who can bring people together and create a structure. And then also the FAB office is a really great pollinator that can move between those different dots and connect people. And it's a really important function that the office serves. And so with this program, we're trying to really highlight that. Next is we talked to a lot of people about their learning efforts before we got started. And a lot of people had documents that when we asked them, what did you accomplish, they could show you a whole bunch of stuff they'd produced, but they didn't have a lot of information on the results of their learning program or of what had been accomplished. And so we did some web stats, and we can look at when we had events, were people visiting the website, that's one thing. We asked people annually, we interview a subset of people and ask them, did you use the resources? Have you shared them with others? Have you applied that information? Then we also used a form of outcome mapping or outcome harvesting, where we kept a log of the important outcomes and results that happened as we went, and really the story of what happened. And by doing it this way, we're able to really take what often is success stories presented at something like this and create a more rigorous qualitative data set of what happened in the learning effort. Okay. And next is to focus on the people and not the platforms. We're really trying to get people to learn, not to just produce documents or to produce a website. And so one thing to do there is to push information out, and we did that, but then also to pull people in. So we had a newsletter, we had a number of reports, we had a spotlight event just a few hours ago to get information out, but then we also had efforts to pull people in. For example, we did a case example compilation where we put out a call to the CWT community asking for their lessons related to the theory of change, one theory of change for combating wildlife trafficking, and a set of key learning questions. And then another thing that's really important is, the amount of information that's out there is growing exponentially, but people's attention is really limited by how much time they have in a day. There's nothing we can do to really change that. So what we need to do is find ways to grab people's attention and to bring them in. And we know that to do that, you really want things that are interactive, that are story-driven, that are emotionally engaging. And so in that vein, I'm going to actually switch gears pretty hard here, and we're going to try out something new. It's called Who Wants to Be an Effective Conservationist? And we're going to bring down a real live contestant, Andy Tobiasen, I believe. Yes. Let's go to here. He is. Thank you so much, Andy. Andy, if you could have a seat on the far end there. Yeah. I want you to be able to see my notes. Andy, I understand you are a biodiversity conservation advisor at the Forestry and Biodiversity Office. Is that right?
I like to think so.
Excellent. Well, we're going to find out if you're an effective conservationist. Here we go. First question, Andy. Why is it worthwhile for USAID to invest in collaborating, learning, and adapting? Is it because it increases the chances of success? Because it empowers staff? Because it helps to reduce costs? Or because it's required by the ADS?
Okay, well, I do feel empowered, Shawn.
That's good, Andy.
And I do believe in saving money. Mm-hmm. I think all of them look possible to me. Is there a way I could reduce my...
Yes, that's right. You're reminding me of the lifelines here on Who Wants to Be an Effective Conservationist. There's 50-50, there's phone a friend, and there's poll the audience.
50-50, please.
50-50. All right, here we go. There you are.
Oh,
Narrowed it down there for you.
a little bit. I do read the ADS daily,
Yeah, that's right.
but so I think we're not quite there yet on the ADS. I'm going to say A, it increases the chances of success.
All right, is that your final answer?
Final answer.
That is correct, Andy. Excellent job. Next question. MI's cross-mission learning program included 2 collaborative learning groups. Can you name one? Environmental enterprises, combating wildlife slime, community-based natural resource management, or conservation enterprises.
Okay, I think I know this. I don't think I'm going to need any help.
That's good.
But I know one of them has something to do with wildlife, but I don't think it was slime. I'm going to say D, conservation enterprises.
Is that your final answer?
Final answer.
That is correct. Excellent. You are working your way towards perhaps victory. We'll see. Next question, Andy. Which of the following was not a theme identified in MI's Combating Wildlife Trafficking case study compilation? Was it using technology for effective data collection, building effective partnerships, fostering local ownership, or literally throwing books at poachers? Have you read the case example compilation, Andy?
I have read it, thank you. It's excellent. I highly recommend the case study compilation. You know, I believe in throwing the book at poachers, but we did not focus on that in the case study compilation.
That's your final answer?
That's my final answer.
That is correct. Excellent. That was a tough one. Next question, Andy. As you work your way towards victory. According to MI's Combating Wildlife Trafficking case compilation, which of the following factors are not necessary for effective cooperation amongst national, subnational, and local authorities? Is it leveraging expertise from a mix of professionals, building relationships between individual officers, putting yourself out there, or really good snacks?
Well, I didn't have enough lunch today, so I might not be thinking straight on this one. I think they certainly leverage expertise from a mix of professionals, so I think that's not going to be the answer. But I would like, could I get a lifeline on this one, Shawn?
No.
No. Okay. Okay, in that case, I think relationship is also, building is really important. I really don't think, this is probably obvious, but I don't think snacks are really necessary. I'm going to say that snacks are not necessary for effective cooperation.
Snacks not necessary. Right. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, snacks are necessary. Andy, we're going to give you a round of applause. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got one more contestant who I'm going to bring up, Kirsten Sykes. Kirsten, welcome. Kirsten, I believe you are a senior biodiversity policy advisor at the Bureau for Africa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Excellent. Well, I've been given the time card, so we're going to need to move a little bit faster here as we investigate if you are an effective conservationist.
I am in the hot seat.
Here we go. All right. Here we go. First question for Kirsten. According to MI's recent report, The Nature of Conservation Enterprises, a 20-year retrospective evaluation, do positive changes in stakeholder behaviors lead to reductions in threats to biodiversity? It's a long question. Should you take it in? Usually. Never. Possibly under certain conditions. Or insufficient evidence.
All right, this is a challenging one. Obviously, we'd love to think usually, but that might be a little too optimistic. Never would just be depressing. You know, I'm going to have to go with possibly under certain conditions. Final answer.
Excellent. That is correct. Wow. Here we go. Which of the following was not identified as an enabling condition for successful conservation enterprises as described in MI's Building a Conservation Enterprise Keys for Success? Was it stakeholder alignment, profit potential, financial management skills, or a positive attitude?
Wow, okay. So not enabling condition. I think profit is incredibly important. People want a profit when these things.
Profit's important, yeah.
Skills are good. We need to have some skills. Alignment, I think that's pretty important too. I'd love to think positive attitude is important, but you know what? I'm going to go with positive attitude not being so much of a important. Thank you.
Excellent. Positive
Let's
attitude.
go.
That's
Positive
your final
attitude.
answer.
Final
Yes.
answer.
That is right.
Okay.
It's actually the only thing in life that doesn't require a positive attitude.
Surprisingly, yeah.
That's surprising. Next, past activities indicate that conservation enterprise approaches work well as standalone projects, work well in combinations with other strategic approaches, usually fail in the first few years, or are very straightforward to implement.
Do I have the option of a lifeline here?
Yes, you do. In fact, you can ask the audience.
Well, you know, they looked pretty impressive when I walked in. They looked like a smart group. So I'm going to go with the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. So, audience, we're going to pitch this over to you. If you think it's A, we'd like you to raise your hand now. If you think it's work well as standalone projects, nobody or everyone's shy. If you think they work well in combination with other strategic approaches, oh my goodness.
Ooh.
That seems to be almost everyone. If you think they usually fail in the first few years, the pessimists here, there are some pessimists here in the audience, yep, are very straightforward to implement. These are the optimists. Nobody. Okay, there you've got your information.
You know, I think I made the right choice. Smart group. Definitely let's go with work well in combination with other strategic approaches.
Okay, excellent. Hold on, ignore this. Yes, correct. Yeah,
Okay.
you're really cooking along.
Yeah, so far so good.
We might have our first effective conservationist here on the
That would
program.
be exciting. I would love some verification.
I'm hearing this is our final question. Where can interested audience members find more resources on effective approaches to combating wildlife trafficking and conservation enterprises? Google Scholar,
Okay,
the Discovery Channel,
great.
a lot of information there. Forwarded emails from an uncle. Or the USAID Biodiversity Conservation Gateway.
You know, all good options, but and I think this is actually the easiest of questions. I have D bookmarked on my desktop. Everyone else should have it bookmarked too. USAID Biodiversity Conservation Gateway, final answer.
Excellent. Let's see if that's right.
Think so?
It is. Excellent. Congratulations, Kirsten. You are an effective conservationist.
Thank you very much.
You can come over here and get your effective conservationist prize. This is
Exciting.
an elephant made out of pure gold.
So I get to melt this down, and it's kind of light. Pick up in chips.
It's that light gold. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Okay, very quickly, I just want to sum up a little bit of what I've presented. We talked about the cross-mission learning program and how we wanted to get environment officers around the world learning from each other. We talked about how we started 2 collaborative learning groups, one on combating wildlife trafficking and one on conservation enterprises. We mentioned a whole host of products that were produced and which are available outside in the resource table. And we encourage you to go take a look at those. And then we also talked about the Biodiversity Conservation Gateway and how this is where you can find more resources, information, recorded webinars. Almost everything we've done is available there. So that's the end. I'm going to hand it over now to Andres. Yes. Andres, thank you so much. Yep. Yeah. Okay. I think there's another slide for you to rest on.
There's a slide, okay. What do you? There we go. Okay. And now for something completely different. Lesson learned, never follow Shawn. I am not Diane Russell. My name is Andres Gomez. I work for ICF. Pardon? Oh, sorry. I work for ICF, and I'm the lead of Measuring Impact's evidence team. I'm very pleased to be here today, and it has been a privilege for ICF to be a partner in Measuring Impact, to apply our experience in evidence-based development solutions, and to help USAID implement adaptive management in its biodiversity programs. I want to acknowledge the work of Natalie Dubois from Environmental Incentives, Anila Jacob and Kristen Johnson, who were the founding members of our evidence team, and Sarah Carlson from USAID, who's our current activity manager. Our work building the evidence base began by identifying important research needs in conservation and development through a systematic multi-stakeholder process. We then focused on developing evidence products around priority themes and questions we identified by working together with USAID staff. We then had the opportunity to work directly with missions, providing technical assistance around several tasks related to using and generating evidence in biodiversity programs. And finally, as you heard from Cynthia, we developed Evidence in Action, our guidance resource for implementing evidence-based biodiversity conservation. We believe that through this three-pronged approach of evidence products, technical assistance, and providing guidance, we have helped USAID implement evidence-based conservation, and thereby we've helped amplify the impacts of the investments of one of the world's largest conservation donors. Through our work, we have learned that evidence must always be both relevant and accessible to its intended audience, that increasing access to evidence products is necessary, but ultimately not sufficient for fostering evidence-based approaches, and that we should strive to use and generate evidence not as an end in itself, but because evidence helps us make better decisions. Evidence-based approaches help us reduce risk and improve outcomes. And on that note, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker. Diane Russell has been here already. Her career includes work in rural development, agricultural and agroforestry research, and biodiversity conservation. She has a PhD in anthropology and a master's degree in environmental management. And before her recent retirement, she was a senior social scientist for the Office of Forestry and Biodiversity at USAID, where she led the office's work on research and evidence, gender, food security, and support to Central and West Africa. She was the manager of the evidence portfolio at Measuring Impact for the first 5 years of the project, and our work would not have been possible without her vision and guidance. And for me, it's fairly gratifying that probably my last public action in MI is to say, welcome, Dr. Diane Russell.
Thank you so much, Andres. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm just so excited to see this audience and see some old friends and make some new friends. As you know, as you may have heard from my earlier presentation at noon today, I've been retired for 2 weeks. I love it. I highly recommend it. But because of that fact, I am not speaking on behalf of USAID or the US government, so just keep that in mind. They called me back because they do call me Little Miss Evidence. So, and I want to dedicate this talk to Sarah, Andres, and Natalie because they are the evidence champions and they've been, with me on this journey, and they're fantastic colleagues. So I'm going to start by retelling a story I told at the MI retreat last year. It illustrates some points I want to make in this talk and explains why evidence is so personally important to me, as I think it should be to all of us. Evidence is really, it's a visceral thing. It's something that really, really matters in this world. So 27 years ago, I was a postdoc at an agricultural research center in Cameroon, where I was tasked to study shifting cultivation, or slash and burn. In part to test this technology developed to move shifting cultivators to more permanent cultivation. My team and I spent 2 years in the field studying the farming system, and it became very clear that the technology, which had generated a lot of buzz and support in the global research community and in the donor community, would never be widely adopted by the farmers we were working with. But despite our meticulous documentation of the system and the parameters farmers used to make decisions, we could not get the senior scientists working on this technology to consider our recommendations. It took years for the technology to be discredited. A gifted economist I worked with, who was also a critic of the approach, she was actually not even allowed to publish her findings, and she ended up leaving international ag research. And I also left the field, fortunately finding a soulmate of a discipline, biodiversity conservation. I naively believed that if you presented clear evidence, it would be welcomed, embraced, and used. But our findings threatened an approach that powerful scientists and donors believed had great promise. It was that magic bullet that would reduce deforestation, enhance productivity, and improve livelihoods. Sound familiar? When I started to do research on evidence-based approaches, I came across a video that explained how in medicine there was an evolution away from eminence-based approaches that privileged expert opinion, such as those guys I worked with, towards evidence-based approaches, which I will define later. This really resonated, as you can imagine. We know from our work in political economy that power and influence shape actions and outcomes. Power can trump evidence, but less so if there is a system in place that encourages, incentivizes, or even mandates that decision makers consider evidence in structured ways. Think about how this evidence revolution makes us safer and healthier. Airlines and physicians use checklists that are continually updated to reflect new evidence. Evidence about Ebola outbreaks matched with maps of wildlife use and distribution as developed by our research partner, the Center for International Forestry Research, can help predict new outbreaks. So this is a tremendous use of evidence that can really save lives. Yet we have to remain vigilant. Despite amazing medical advances, we continue to be inundated with unsound medical practices and cures pushed out by sophisticated media campaigns. So despite the fact of having evidence, you really have to be discerning. And the good news is that unsound practices can be identified with training in evidence-based approaches. So if the evidence for that miracle cure consists of a case study or an anecdote, think again before risking your health on them. And again, I'm going to get personal. I'm a cancer survivor, and if I'd gotten my cancer 50 years ago, I wouldn't be here today. And if I'd used acupuncture or Reiki or whatever to try to cure it, I also wouldn't be here today, because I trust my doctors and I trust evidence. As Neil deGrasse Tyson recently tweeted, "If pundits tell you something is true and you don't have the critical thinking skills to evaluate their statements, then you are putty in their hands and they shape your worldview to their will." So how does this personal history relate to our work in biodiversity conservation and the approaches we develop through measuring impact? The lessons are that 1, evidence matters. I survived to give this talk, so it's pretty important to me. Poor farmers in Cameroon could have had the fast-growing fruit trees they needed rather than the soil fertility trees they didn't need or want many years earlier. So they could have really benefited from having the evidence that we collected. And 2, an evidence-based approach requires working the system. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to just have the evidence. So within MI, we recognize the urgent need, the clarion call for evidence-based conservation from a growing community. And we've been in touch with that community almost from the start. And early on, we took an institutionalizing approach to evidence. Before I detail the approach, let me quickly define evidence in an evidence-based approach. So evidence is a body of facts assembled to test a theory or an approach. Facts or data can and should be derived from diverse sources, as Melissa talked about earlier. A triangulation of multiple data sources is best practice. An evidence-based approach constantly looks at new data, research, and studies, and reevaluates practice based on findings, so adaptive management. But going beyond, it enhances adaptive management for the use of external to a project sources of evidence, emphasis on the quality of the evidence and the quality of the evidence review. So in the FAB office with MI, as Andres noted, we first collaboratively developed a research agenda that identified and prioritized research questions emerging from the USAID biodiversity policy. We drew upon peer-reviewed papers that prioritize biodiversity research questions and also our expert knowledge across the agency. This exercise turned out to be a lot of fun. It was energizing. In fact, all you supervisors out there, intellectual curiosity is one of the most important drivers of employee satisfaction. So remember that. People really get into evidence. We then set out to get some evidence on prioritized questions. For example, what was the role of communities in combating wildlife trafficking? We had a lot of experience in community-based conservation, but the trafficking focus was relatively new. This was back a number of years ago. Was there evidence that community involvement could play a role, and what role? So read the evidence product if you want to find out. Women's empowerment was emerging as a priority in the agency. Could gender integration and women's empowerment make a difference in conservation outcomes? So we wanted to move beyond the add women and stir approach, which was common in conservation projects, and really see how and where gender equality and women's empowerment achieves conservation outcomes. So read the paper. On the programmatic front, we developed the framework for an evidence-based approach, which I'm going to very briefly walk you through. First, you need, oh, that's a new BFI there. Cool. First, you need to select the biodiversity focal interest that best fits with what the evidence indicates about regional, national, and local biodiversity priorities and threats, as Olaf was describing that the mission did in the Amazon, and match that with your comparative advantage, your resources, other donor investments, mission priorities, and other parameters. Then you build a model of variables that impact the health and survival of this interest, be it a species, landscape, or assemblage of interests. The model, situation model, doesn't emerge from thin air. It comes from data, information, ideally a diversity of information sources. Where data and information are lacking, these gaps are flagged. And Melissa said, you don't have to have all the information up front. You can get information later. You can fill those gaps as you move ahead. We may know that a threat is important, but not how it is linked to particular power structures that will impact the way that we can mitigate it. For instance, we knew in Indonesia, as Rebecca was talking about, that the rapid expansion of oil palm plantations was a huge threat, but did not know how to best influence decisions about allocating oil palm concessions, as it turned out that many decisions were made outside of the public view. So thus the need for the political economy analysis that Rebecca mentioned to fill some of those evidence gaps. From the model, a theory or set of interlocking theories is developed. The theory becomes a series of actions, which are really mini hypotheses, those boxes and arrows that Cynthia talked about, mini hypotheses that an action will lead to a reaction and ultimately to biodiversity conservation. During implementation, these hypotheses are tested. This is where it gets interesting. What intellectual and financial resources should we and do we put into the testing? You know, it's that whole tension of doing and learning. So you can develop a measure for that action output and a measure for the reaction outcome. But in a robust system, I mean, this is a system I like. I'm a little biased on the learning side and the research side. You should also be tracking context variables and feedback loops to enhance that evidence base. And I think, you know, I'm going to explain why that's so important down the line to have that evidence base. Because what happens if the theory is found to be weak or even falsified? What is our responsibility as donors, implementers, and participants? Or if some parties think it's wrong and other parties think it's just great, then what do? You're not on the same page. Then the quality of the evidence makes a big difference, the intellectual and financial resources put into the testing. And if there is a system for review that is impartial, for instance, peer review, collaboration with a research institution that might be neutral, or an independent evaluator. This doesn't mean you have to do randomized control trials to test each hypothesis. It's about due diligence. But so much rides on a project's success. The implementer gets continued funding and enhanced reputation. The donor has a success story, like this guy's very happy here. Resource flows continue to beneficiaries. that there's a huge pressure to give greater weight to positive findings. That's why I stress the importance of an external, neutral body of evidence, the quality of evidence and the quality of the evidence review. And this is really where our conservation community is going, and I think that's where we're going to. And it certainly sounds from what Melissa talked about this morning, that's really where the agency wants to go. The good news is that projects designed around a theory of change are easier to monitor and evaluate because there is a path to follow and evidence can build up around a common theory of change. As those of you who were here at noon today, when we learned about the conservation conservation enterprise theory of change. An example is the evaluation we undertook with MI of our Global Scapes program. For the evaluation, we delineated, among others, a conservation enterprise theory of change that the evaluators could examine across landscapes. The evaluators were able to use that draft theory of change to get data, common data across the sites, and then they also added some variables to the theory in the process of doing the evaluation, which really enriched it. Soon after, colleagues at IIED, together with some folks from C4, MI, and FAB, we systematically reviewed the evidence on the similar topic of alternative livelihoods and conservation, which has been mentioned a few times. So we know that Megan and her colleagues and Shawn and MI have developed this fantastic body of evidence around conservation enterprises, and they've done so much great work to disseminate it. So now we really have no excuse as an agency if we design a conservation enterprise activity without reviewing that body of evidence and absorbing it. There's really no excuse. The evidence is there, the body of evidence is there, the theory of change is there. But let's get back to power. Sorry, I am a political economist, can't help it. What if we have that solid evidence and a powerful person wants to pursue an alternative livelihood or conservation enterprise approach under what we know are unfavorable conditions, because we know what the enabling conditions are for conservation enterprises? This is where our community is so important. This is where we need to support one another in taking an evidence-based approach. So I hope you are wondering, how do I do this? What tools do I need in the USAID context in order to implement an evidence-based approach? So we have a fantastic resource for you. MI's Evidence in Action was designed for our biodiversity community to learn and grow its practice. It's packed with knowledge and tips tailored to the USAID context and accompanied by an easy-to-use online tool called Acting on the Evidence. Think of it as a self-help manual to build your skills in critical thinking and being an evidence champion. I'd like you to join some terrific evidence champions such as Carl Worcester in Nepal, who read the IIED review. He actually read it and decided to use that to really strengthen the alternative livelihood approaches in Nepal. And even, I believe he even is doing an impact evaluation. Or Anna Tonis, who's now in Brazil, but when she was in Zambia, welcomed me and Sarah Carlson and others to test whether climate-smart ag would reduce pressure on natural forests. And that was a very, very interesting long-term test. So, to round out the story, I want to report that I am still working with my former research assistants from Cameroon, my great friends Nico and Antoine. We worked together on the Central African Regional Program for the Environment, and it was an early MI adopter, and where is Vinaya? We have not given up. We have not given up. We are continuing the fight for evidence within CARPE. We're drawing on insights from our fieldwork. For example, it's really hard to transform shifting cultivation. We know that now, and we're generating new evidence. And over several years, our office has forged a solid relationship with C4, which adopted evidence-based forestry to reduce the allure of fads, nostrums, and silver bullet technologies, such as the one we tried to debunk. So be part of the community, speak truth to power when that is needed, because often that's the only way our practice advances. And since we are talking about saving the world, stopping the hemorrhaging of biodiversity on the planet, there's really nothing more important that we can do. Thank you.
Diane, thank you so much. And I'm going to ask the panelists to return to the stage now. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. We're running a few minutes behind schedule. And then Colin's going to offer some closing remarks. At that point, we'll invite you all to come over to the reception and we'll continue the Q&A there. So as we're assembling back here, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Staff of the Wilson Center are walking around with microphones. Please wait till you have a microphone in your hand until you ask your question. And we would love to know your name and institutional affiliation. I see one in the back, yes. I'm going to take a few questions and then have you guys answer.
Hi, my name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector advisor with my own firm. I know you don't want speeches, and I'm not going to make one, but I want to sort out a thought, and I wonder if you'd just indulge me for a minute. I was interested in the discussion about procurement and, I've forgotten the word, give me 1 second, please, adaptive management, and that whole concept. And it seemed to me that in this whole discussion, there was one little piece that was missing, which is the underlying thesis that all of this is derivative of the fact that Congress doesn't trust USAID to shepherd the funds properly. And in order to make that clear, you are forced to jump through across all these hurdles and all these hoops to make it crystal clear that you really are excellent shepherds of the people's money. So my question is, can you turn that around and think of it from a private sector perspective, where this kind of monitoring would probably not be necessary because the contractor would lose the business too quickly. You all are familiar with the slogan, "We brought the project in on time and on budget." That's an anthem to contractors. So my question is there a way to incentivize the implementing partners, the technical specialists in the bureaus, everybody whose fingerprints are on these projects, so that it's in their own best interests to bring it in on budget and ahead of time in order to be able to qualify for the next deal with less onerous monitoring and evaluation? Thanks for allowing me to say all that.
Super, Stan, thank you. That's a great question. Any other questions I can take? I've got one here from Scott, it looks like.
Yeah, really briefly, this for the panel. Scott Lampman, USAID. I know early on you talked about developing MI Light, some of the tools light because of the onus on the missions. Did you ever get to that point? And if you, by the way, if you answered that already and I didn't hear it, just ignore the question.
We'll answer it. Thanks, Scott. One more, Tim.
Tim Resch, retired USAID. I sense some confrontation with the concept of an RFP and an RFA, or a contracting officer's representative and an agreement officer's representative. And I mean, we're taught that those are different instruments for different purposes with different recourse and such. And so I thought Rebecca's response about how we can be more effective RFPs, I'd like to hear what the constraints are under the RFA grants and agreements side of procurement, because I don't think all the things that Rebecca mentioned are, that the RFA may fix some of those problems.
Super, that's a great question, thank you. Rebecca, could I ask you to take Stan's question about how we can increase the incentives?
I'll give it a shot.
It's an easy one.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is it's not really just about on time and on budget. It's really about the results you're trying to achieve. And that is in biodiversity conservation, I think we struggle with what are the metrics to say this is the outcome we want, have we achieved that outcome? So you can have a contract where you say you're going to do this many trainings, you're going to change these policies, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And you can do all of those things on budget and on time and completely fail in achieving your biodiversity outcomes. And so the real question is, how do we better define and be more explicit about what those biodiversity outcomes are, and then how can we measure them? And then have everybody align in that incentives to achieving those outcomes. I think that's the challenge, is defining and knowing how to measure those outcomes.
I'm going to invite you to do that at the reception. Thanks. Vinaya, would you be able to talk to us a little bit about what Scott said about MI Light and maybe give people some context for what MI Light is?
Sure. So we didn't speak to that directly, Scott, so it's a good question. It does relate, however, to the concept that we wanted these tools and approaches to be not overly onerous or burdensome, but instead be helpful and constructive use of missions and partners' time and energy. And not in all cases was it appropriate to have a full-on 1 week, 2 week in-person workshop that took up a lot of resources and a lot of time. And in those cases, we did what I think Olaf referred to as we tried to meet the missions where they were. And if they really only needed to test out this approach specifically for designing a new activity, then we could, use virtual means to work with them and be creative about how we interacted with them to provide them the tools and the support that they needed, using that light touch or not as intensive a lift on either of our parts to help them get there. And there are several examples of us having done that with various missions. And what's interesting is I think pretty much all of those missions, they've circled back to us and requested more support over the life of what they initially thought would be a quick light touch. They really wanted more.
Great. Thank you, Vinaya. Olaf, I'm going to turn to you for Tim's question about how we can use these approaches differently under an agreement or grant than we do under a contract.
Yeah, I would say the approaches are equally valid for both designing a program that's ultimately implemented via a contract through an RFP or through an RFA. A cooperative agreement, of course, USAID has less sort of direct involvement in terms of being able to direct the implementer on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. But we do have, as USAID, we have the ability to provide technical input during the work planning process. And if we build in the opportunity to use some of these practices in that work planning process, I think we would be able to apply some of these and help shape the following year's work plans based on adaptive management, based on new information. And I think it is important to think about how they're different, but RFAs are a great tool, and they buy into an existing program of work that an implementer is doing in the field, and that's really important. But I think we also have a responsibility to be challenging our implementers and ourselves to look at new approaches and consider the innovations and the evidence. So I think they could be applied to RFAs as well. It is a little bit different because it's not a contract situation, but I think they could be equally effective there.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to take another round of questions if we have some. Tony.
Hi, it's Tony Pryor from PPL. One question that I've always wondered about in these issues, having unfortunately worked in a long time in the past in this, is a timeline. AID views these things in 5-year increments, and yet, in fact, none of the problems you're talking about are 5-year problems.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we monitor? And also, AID has a horrible habit of stopping monitoring once the money ends.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we keep track of long-term change? I think theories of change are one way, but the theories of change often are defined in the 5-year bits rather than something that tells you, I'm here today and I'm going to be in Cleveland next 10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to hear all of you, what you have to say about that.
Great, that's a great question, thank you. Shall we tackle that one, or do I have another hand? Yes. Here, you've got a mic over here.
My name is Safi Hamid, Chatham University, and I ask this question of anyone of the panel. Sharing a body of knowledge, especially a new body of knowledge like what all these approaches you're promoting, with a diverse group of stakeholders that means that you are crossing a lot of cultural barriers, especially from the world of ideas and science to the average people in the field, and also consultants and so on, and especially and language barriers and so on. Could you tell us from your experience, how did you manage to do all that simultaneously and successfully, hopefully? Thanks.
It's a great question, thank you. Maybe I'll let Olaf and Diane take Tony's question about the timeline and how we grapple with that.
Sure, happy to start. Actually, and that's an interesting, we did a pause and reflect in the Nepal mission just a couple of months ago. And like I said before in my remarks, it was a whole new technical area. So when we started up with the program there and we worked out these results chains, these theories of change with the implementing partner, it all looked really logical and easy, and so, do the training, the people will do the, it's very clear. When we stepped back after a year and looked at that and said, wow, okay, so what have we done in this year and where are we going to get to over the lifetime of this investment? I mean, this was a kind of 20-year theory of change, it could be, that we had constructed. And yes, we were working on really important parts that were going to move us along the way, and they are. But the ultimate result, I mean, this is a whole new area working in freshwater conservation. There's no way that we were going to accomplish it in a 5-year horizon. So I think in that case, being realistic about what is achievable, but also being honest that you're stepping into a new area and making a long-term commitment. I do think we have to go to a longer-term commitment than just 5 years at a time or 3 years at a time. These long-term investments really need time to pay off, and we need to learn, and we need to bring new partners into the fold. So in terms of sustainability, bringing governments in to replicate the same kind of practices, it takes a long time, and I absolutely agree. So it's simplistic to put up a theory of change and think you're going to accomplish it quickly, but it really does represent a longer-term vision, I think, and that's really what is important that comes out of it.
Diane, do you have anything to add?
Sure. As those of you who know me know, I've been working with the CARPE program for 17 years. So I have a perspective on the long-term nature of conservation and the need for adaptive management within a program that really hadn't changed very much over the years. With the help of MI, we started to shake things up a little bit and started to look at new threats. Like, CWT was something that came in a few years ago and just had to reshape to address that. The scale, we have to start thinking bigger. I think it's fantastic to have these long-term projects, but they can't be static. They have to be evolving and bringing in new evidence. We've done targeted analyses, a better process of 118, 119. I'm looking at Hadass there, our forestry and biodiversity analyses that can bring that new evidence to use to reshape the program, and then constantly reviewing the theory of change.
Thank you. That's great. Vinay, I'm going to give you the last minute to answer Sophie's question about our experience applying these approaches in many different contexts, many cultural contexts.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's not a challenge to be underestimated. And this is where it was really critical to have the input and the voice of people who are in the field working in the missions and amongst the partners that we interacted with to help with translating, not necessarily across language barriers, but across cultural barriers as well. And all jokes aside about boxes and arrows, the beauty and elegance of the simplicity of shapes and symbols and colors and simple language really helps to cut across cultural barriers, social barriers, and it's something that is easily understood and communicated.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to invite you to stay up here as Colin comes to the stage to offer some closing remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for being an adaptive audience. I know it's really hard to squeeze 6 years of work and lessons into 2 hours. And so I think we're almost there, a little bit over, but I really appreciate that you guys are still here. So thanks, Liz, and thanks to our panel. Thanks to all those who have participated today. As you've heard, MI represents a major effort by the Forestry and Biodiversity Office to implement the biodiversity policy. this work is important, as Diane Russell likes to say. It represents nothing less than the health of the planet. She usually says that with an exclamation point, as you can imagine. She's an evangelist for evidence and for this kind of work. By bringing the open standards for conservation into USAID, merging them with the ADS, and coming up with tools that help us implement more adaptive practices and learn from them, we're really helping change the way that USAID does business. And so that takes time, and it's not easy. With MI support, we delivered excellent technical assistance to a whole bunch of missions, 20 missions at this point. I think that's probably as far as we're going to get for the couple months to go. We have a core set of tools that you've heard about today, the how-to guides in particular, that core set that kind of guide design teams through the process of developing theory of change-based approaches. And those are all outside on the tables. And these tools really help us increase the likelihood that we can take American generosity and our collective commitment, effort, and good intention and convert that into results. So we're not just basing our approaches on what the latest expert has said, but on what actually has shown to work. I think anyone involved with FAB and MI, anyone we've worked with inside or outside of USAID would agree that it's been a lot of work. It's been a ton of work. And as my distinguished colleague Andy Tobiasen likes to say, it's not rocket science. It's harder, actually, probably, right? I mean, it's pretty complex. Any close? Yeah, well, any rocket scientists in the room? Okay. So it's extremely complex, and I think that's a theme that you've heard throughout the day, especially if you were here for the Conservation Enterprises retrospective evaluation conversation, and then throughout this conversation we've had during the closeout. It's complex, it takes time, it takes longer than 5 years. Yeah, it's frustrating, right? We try to do longer programs, we have some limitations, but we do our best within the constraints that we have. So because the work is so complex, it takes time, patience, and disciplined action to achieve results. It's taken time to implement, to bring the open standards into the program cycle. It's taken time to figure out how to implement CLA and develop tools to do that. It's taken time, it just takes time to monitor performance, reflect, adapt, and then proceed ahead and keep going. I think I think it's worth pointing out that we're not boldly going where no one's gone before. Again, referencing Diane's talk, there's this use of evidence is very common, and evidence-based approach is very common in health and education. Environmental evidence is something that's up and coming. There's no reason we can't continue to build that evidence base and improve our approaches. But it's not an easy process. But as you've heard today, we really did accomplish a lot in spite of this. It's really hasn't been 5 years. Actually, we managed to extend it by a year, so it's a 6-year project. That helps a little bit. It's not always possible to do that. But it really wouldn't have been possible without all of the support from our colleagues in OAA and PPL, across FAB, the regional bureaus, missions, and implementing partners. And so just briefly, I want just to quickly recognize a few of the folks who have been really instrumental to the success of the program. And those are from folks across USAID and our implementer, the Prime Environmental Incentives and their subs, Foundations of Success, and then ICF. And those folks are Cynthia Gill, Marco Flores Santiago, Rebecca Butterfield, Olaf Zerbach, Megan Hill, Diane Russell, Sarah Carlson, Liz Locke, Caroline Cook, Shelley Hicks, Shawn Peabody, Andres Gomez, Tess Present, Amy Gambrill, Richard Margulies, who's with us today here, Nick Solowski, and Jeremy Sokulski. So can we give them a quick round of applause? Thanks, everybody. And if I missed someone, I'm really sorry if I didn't. So all of this work has also been in partnership and with our field staff, so drawing upon the knowledge of our field staff and implementing partners, testing the tools that we've developed and refining them in coordination with them. We had those regional webinars for that reason and to recognize those folks. So I just want to make sure to mention that again. This is really all about what we've learned from folks in the field, and then we've done our best to apply what we've learned here by looking at the evidence base and implementing USAID policy. On a personal note, I just want to say what a great experience this has been to be back here in Washington and be able to be a part of this Measuring Impact contract. Has been really fulfilling. I think some of you can relate probably that it feels like all of my time, like all my me time has become MI time, and those are not really the same thing. There's a lot less Netflix I get to watch. There's a lot of reports you have to read, review, clear. It's like a never-ending process that will soon end in a couple months. So that's kind of exciting too, actually. There's a plus. There's an upside to this. But the journey continues to build country capacity to implement better biodiversity conservation programs, and we will continue even after MI stops. The health of the planet depends on it. This is really important work. I think you're here because you do recognize that. We're kind of preaching to the choir. But I think so that wraps up our formal program. We have a reception that'll go until 6 o'clock across the hall over here in the same place that we had lunch. You didn't get to ask a lot of questions because we sort of ran out of time. So the folks are around. If you have any pent-up questions or anyone you want to chat with about MI or anything else, we'll be here. We have all of our resources out there. They're here for you. So collect them, take them, cherish them, pass them on to your friends. And a final plug, go visit the Biodiversity Conservation Gateway, bookmark it, frequent it, and contribute if you can. I mean, learn from this great site. It's not just the products from MI. Actually, all the stuff we produce, we put up there. And so there's a lot of great material for you to sift through. It's one of the legacies of the program. This is produced for the public. Just about everything we've made is available and out there to improve conservation from all those who participate in that. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.